People ask me how it started. I tell them it started with a crack in a chest plate, and they assume I mean something poetic. I don't. I mean an actual crack, 17 centimeters, running diagonal across the left articulation joint of Queen Vareth Song-Kaz's ceremonial battle armor, the one she'd been wearing when the skirmish at the Kethoran border ridge went sideways, and a fragment of something. The after-action report called it unclassified propulsion debris, caught her at close range. The armor held. The Queen walked out of it. The chest plate did not survive intact. That's where I came in. My name is Kale Dawn. I was 41 years old and 7 months into a compact civilian field contract at Forward Outpost Kethoran, which is a polite name for a collection of composite panel buildings on the windward side of a moon that the Velson First Compact and 3 other parties all technically claimed, and none of them had fully settled. I'd spent 14 years as a maintenance sergeant in the compact expeditionary before that, and before that I'd grown up watching my father repair agricultural equipment in a barn on a world that mattered to no one. What that combination gives you is an intimate understanding of broken things and a very low threshold for being impressed by institutional authority. The outpost senior court armorer was a Velson named Vareth Salntal. He'd been managing the Queen's armor complement for 11 years. He knew the certification protocols, the replacement draw procedures, the maintenance records for every piece of equipment the Royal Guard carried. What he knew how to do specifically was work within the system. When the system said, irreparable field damage, request replacement from depot, Vareth knew how to file the request. He'd done it 14 times. The problem was the depot was 42 hours away at best transit speed, and dawn muster was 4 hours out, and Queen Vareth Song-Kaz was expected to stand review of her full guard complement in armor at dawn. Without armor, there was no review. Without review, there was a protocol breach that the other 3 parties claiming this moon would notice and interpret as a sign of weakness at a moment when the border ridge situation was still unresolved. I was in the armory bay doing routine maintenance on a rack of guard sidearms when Vareth made his assessment. He didn't know I was there, or he didn't consider it worth noting. He set the cracked chest plate on the central stand under the work lights, ran a scanner over the joint, looked at the readout, and said in trade language, clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "The articulation housing is compromised beyond field repair parameters. I'll submit the depot request at first light. The Queen will review from the command position until the replacement arrives." The Queen was standing 4 meters away. 8 of her personal guard were present. None of them said anything. Vareth began logging the request on his terminal. I looked at the crack. 17 centimeters, diagonal. The housing material was Velson combat-grade alloy, a copper titanium composite with a trace element structure that I'd read about in technical documentation, but had never worked with directly. The crack had propagated cleanly. The debris impact had been high velocity and precise, which meant the fracture surfaces were still aligned. The articulation joint itself, the moving part that allowed the chest plate to flex with the wearer's breathing and torso movement, had separated at the housing lip but hadn't sheared. I set down the sidearm I'd been calibrating. I walked over to the stand. I looked at the crack from 3 angles. "It's not irreparable," I said. Vareth turned. He looked at me the way people look at something they hadn't expected to produce sound. "This is a certified assessment under compact field maintenance protocol," he said. "The housing material requires depot-grade tooling. The housing material requires heat application, correct bonding compound in about 4 hours," I said. "I don't have the depot compound. I have a substitute that will work." "A substitute." He said the word with a particular flatness that means the person saying it considers the conversation over. "A copper silicate bonding resin with a thermal application cycle," I said. "The thermal coefficients are within 8% of the standard Velson field compound. The joint will hold." You've worked with Velsun combat-grade alloy before. I've read the material specifications. The silence in the armory bay was the kind that has a shape to it. I could hear the ventilation running. I could hear the wind outside, which was constant on Kethoran. Varath looked at the Queen. This human is a civilian contractor assigned to sidearm maintenance, he said. He has no certification for armor-grade work. The Queen had been watching me since I walked to the stand. She had pale silver eyes, the color of metal that had been left in weather for a long time. They were very still. Her skin was amber gold and scaled at the jaw and cheekbones, the Velsun battle lineage markers, expressed most strongly in the royal line, and her dark copper hair was pulled back in the field arrangement she'd been wearing since the Ridge skirmish. She had not changed, which meant she'd been in the command post managing the after-action reporting since the armor came off. It was past the second hour past midnight. She looked at me for a long moment, not at Varath. "Your name," she said. It wasn't a question exactly, but it expected an answer. "Kael'Dawn. How confident are you?" Confident enough to tell you to your face, instead of waiting for Varath to leave the room. Something moved at the edge of her expression, not a smile, something that looked like a preliminary assessment being updated. "You have until dawn muster," she said. "If the armor fails inspection, I'll note that the human contractor from sidearm maintenance made an assessment error under field pressure." She paused. "If it holds, I'll note something else." She walked out. 7 of the 8 guards followed her. The 8th, a young male guard named Sareth Veltuer, I'd learn his name later. He had a habit of arriving to meals exactly at the closing bell, stayed by the door, watching. I didn't know if that was standard protocol or something the Queen had arranged. I decided it didn't matter. Varath stood at his terminal for a moment. He logged the depot request anyway. Then he looked at me with an expression I'd seen on senior NCOs who decided to let a junior make a mistake so they could document it, and he left without another word. I pulled the chest plate off the stand and carried it to the grinding bench. The first thing you do with a broken piece of metal is understand it. Not the documentation, not the certification manual, not what someone else told you about the material. You look at the fracture surfaces. You run your thumb along the crack to feel how the grain of the material is oriented. You hold the piece at an angle under the work light and you look for what the metal is doing. Whether the fracture ran through the grain or along it, whether there's deformation at the edges, whether the surfaces are clean. The crack was clean. The grain was tight. The fracture had run diagonally because the housing had a microscopic pre-stressed seam at that angle, not a manufacturing defect, just the nature of how the casting had cooled, and the impact had followed the path of least resistance. The articulation joint itself was intact. The housing lip had separated but hadn't deformed. The surfaces would seat. I got my bonding kit and found the copper silicate resin. I'd brought it for a specific sidearm repair that had been on my list for 2 weeks. It was close enough chemistry for what I needed. I ran a quick calculation on the thermal cycle. The coefficient mismatch Varath would have cited, the 8% I'd mentioned, was real but manageable if I ran the heat application in stages rather than in a single cycle. Slower, more controlled. The resin would seat properly, and the bond would be stronger than a single-stage application would produce. I set up the heat applicator and started the first stage. This is the part of the work where most people stop paying attention because nothing visible is happening. The material is heating at a controlled rate. The resin is being prepared. You're watching numbers on a readout and making small adjustments. I've done this kind of work in barns and in maintenance bays and in field positions with improvised equipment, and it always looks the same from the outside. A person staring at a piece of metal. What it feels like from the inside is different. When you know a material, when you understand how it behaves under heat and pressure and stress, the work has a particular quality of attention to it. You're not waiting. You're reading. The readout tells you temperature. The metal tells you something more nuanced than temperature if you know how to listen. I was 15 minutes into stage 1 when I tried the first application. I ran the resin into the fracture surfaces with the bonding stylus, applied heat, pressed the seam closed. It didn't hold. Not badly, the resin seated at the surface and the seam closed visually. But when I ran the pressure test, the housing lip separated again at the northern end of the fracture. The resin had bonded at the surface without penetrating, which meant the thermal stage hadn't driven the material temperature high enough to open the grain structure before I applied the resin. I reset. I set the temperature target 5 degrees higher. I waited the full stage 1 cycle again. Second application, resin in, heat applied, seam pressed. I ran the pressure test. The seam held at the northern end this time. The southern end separated. I stood at the bench for a moment. The grinding bench's surface lamp was bright and slightly too yellow, which it always was, and the wind was doing its work outside, and the guard at the door was completely still. I looked at the southern end of the fracture. The grain there was denser. The casting had cooled faster at that section, which was why the original pre-stress seam ran diagonal rather than vertical. The denser grain needed a longer heat exposure, not a higher temperature. That distinction mattered. If I raised the temperature further to compensate, I'd damage the surface of the alloy. The Velson copper titanium composite had a narrow working window. The specifications I'd read said 2 degrees of overshoot above the standard target produced surface oxidation. And surface oxidation would compromise the articulation joint seal against the armor undersuit. What I needed was longer, not hotter. I reset for the third time. I adjusted the thermal stage to extend the low temperature exposure by 12 minutes before the high temperature application. Stage 1 again. Full cycle this time, extended. Third application. The resin went in at temperature. I pressed the seam. I held the housing lip closed manually for 60 seconds rather than releasing it immediately. When I lifted my hand, the seam held. I ran the pressure test. Northern end held, southern end held. I ran it again with 20% more force. Held. I ran it across the diagonal midpoint where the grain transition was. Held. I looked at what I had. A sealed fracture, surface bond established. Stages 2 and 3 would drive the bond to depth. But the surface bond was there, which meant the chemistry was right and the grain structure had opened correctly. First application is set, I said, to no one in particular. The guard at the door didn't respond. I hadn't expected him to. I was at the end of the first stage when I heard the door. I didn't look up. I made the stage 1 check and moved to the preparation step for stage 2. You didn't ask for the maintenance specifications, the Queen said. I read them 3 months ago when I submitted my materials inventory request, I said. The depot denied my request for Velson field bonding compound on the grounds that I wasn't certified to use it. I noted the material properties and filed it. A pause, you filed it. In case I needed it for something I wasn't certified to do. I heard her move closer. She stopped at a distance that, in human terms, would have been respectful of the work, close enough to see the bench clearly, not close enough to crowd it. Varath submitted the depot request, she said. I know. He's been my court armorer for 11 years. I know that too. If this doesn't work. I know what it means if it doesn't work, I said. I told you I was confident. I didn't say there was no risk. Another pause, longer this time. What is the risk? I looked at the readout. Stage 1 complete. I began stage 2 preparation. The coefficient mismatch is 8%, I said. If I run a standard single-stage thermal cycle, the resin will seat at the surface but won't penetrate to full bond depth. Under field review condition, standing still, light movement, it holds. Under actual field stress, it would fail in the 3rd or 4th hour of sustained load. I began the second stage. I'm running 3 stages instead of 1. It takes 4 times as long. At the end of the 3rd stage, the bond depth will be within 2% of depot grade work. 2%, she said. 2% means the bond is rated for full field stress up to and including combat load. Depot grade is rated for the same. The difference at 2% is theoretical, not operational. She was quiet for a moment. I could feel her thinking, which is not something I usually say about people I've known for an hour, but it was the correct word for what I was registering. The quality of the silence was the quality of someone working through an assessment. How do you know the specifications for Velson combat-grade alloy? I read the compact materials database when I took the contract. All of it. All of it. I had a long transit. Something happened at the corner of her expression again. This time it lasted a half-second longer before she controlled it. The young guard at the door, Sareth, I learned later, made a small sound that I think he was trying to suppress. "I'll stay," the Queen said. It was not a request. "All right," I said. She found a stool at the side of the bench and sat. She didn't ask questions. She watched the work. I ran stage 2 with the attention it required, and she didn't interrupt it, which I noted as a sign of operational discipline in someone who had more claim on this moment than I did. It would have been entirely within her authority to require updates, to ask for reassurance, to make the work perform for her. She didn't. She watched. I was aware of her watching in the way you're aware of any sustained attention that isn't intrusive. It was present without being a pressure. She was reading the work. After the first 15 minutes, I stopped noticing the attention itself and only noticed, occasionally, the stillness of it. She didn't shift on the stool. She didn't speak. She held the quality of her attention the way the senior guards held formation, precisely, without performance. At the end of stage 2, I checked the fracture surfaces. The resin had penetrated. The bond was forming. I ran a light pressure test along the seam, not a full load test, just the lightest contact, and felt what I'd been hoping for. The surfaces were no longer 2 pieces. They were becoming 1. "First 2 stages are good," I said. She nodded once precisely. I began stage 3 preparation. "The guards," she said, after a minute. "Most of them have been on the border rotation for 6 months. This outpost is not where anyone wants to be assigned." I didn't know if she was making conversation or telling me something specific. I kept preparing stage 3. "The sidearm maintenance backlog when I arrived was 9 weeks overdue," I said. "I cleared it in the first 3 weeks." "I know, I received the maintenance report." Verath's armor records were current. Verath's armor records are always current. The way she said it was flat and precise and meant something specific, which I filed. "He's good at what he's certified to do," I said. "He's not wrong that I'm not certified. He's wrong that uncertified means impossible. He would say that uncertified means unaccountable." "He'd be right," I said. "That's why I'm doing this in front of the guard on the door and told you I'd accept the notation if it fails." A longer pause. "Why?" she said. I looked at the readout. Stage 3 was ready to begin. "Because the armor matters more than whether I'm authorized to fix it," I said. "And because if someone's going to be unaccountable for a decision, they should at least do it in the open." I began stage 3. It's the longest stage. The first 2 stages set the bond. The 3rd stage consolidates it under a sustained lower temperature application that drives the resin fully into the grain structure. You can't rush it. The readout tells you when it's done, but the readout is just measuring temperature and time, and what you're actually waiting for is the chemistry. You can feel it, faintly, in the resistance when you run the pressure applicator along the seam during the cycle. The resin moves from bonded to integrated, which sounds like the same thing and isn't. A bond is 2 surfaces in contact. Integration is one material where 2 surfaces used to be. The Queen was quiet through most of it. The guard at the door had gone very still. I could hear the wind outside, and the ventilation, and the faint sound of the outpost coming to life as dawn approached, distant bootsteps on composite decking, the low hum of a power system cycling up for the day. The third stage takes long enough that you have to manage your own attention during it. There's a point, usually around the 25th minute, where the work has done what you can do to it and the chemistry is proceeding without your help, and the temptation is to step back and wait. I don't step back during this stage. I keep the pressure applicator moving along the seam, running the lightest possible contact, not to press the bond but to read it, to feel the difference between the sections of the seam that have fully integrated and the sections that haven't yet. The information isn't on the readout. It's in the resistance under my fingers. A seam that has integrated reads smooth and continuous, like running your thumb along a flat surface. A seam that's still bonding has a faint trace of discontinuity, not a gap, but the suggestion of where two things are still becoming one. I worked the applicator along the full 17 centimeters of the seam. Northern end, integrated. Southern end, the dense grain section that had taken 3 attempts, integrating but not complete. I adjusted the heat applicator's position by 2 millimeters to concentrate the thermal exposure on the southern quarter of the seam. Held it. The queen watched all of this without asking what I was doing, which meant either she understood that I was adjusting for the grain density, or she understood that asking would be the wrong thing to do at this moment. Either way, the quiet continued, and the work continued inside it. Somewhere around the 30-minute mark, she said, quietly, "My father repaired his own armor. He said a piece of armor that knows the hand that fixed it holds better than a piece that came from a depot." I didn't look up from the readout. "He wasn't wrong about the bond psychology," I said, "though the metallurgy doesn't care who did the work." "No," she agreed. "But the person wearing it might." I thought about that. My father fixed farm equipment. He said the same thing about tractors. She was quiet again, but the quality of the quiet had shifted very slightly. It had become the quiet of someone who has learned something small and unexpected and is holding it carefully. At the 43rd minute of stage 3, I felt the bond complete. It's not dramatic. There's no sound. The resistance under the pressure applicator just becomes the resistance of continuous material rather than two surfaces in contact. One moment you're feeling a seam, the next you're feeling metal. I lifted the applicator. I ran my thumb along the joint, smooth. I ran a visual inspection under the work light at 3 angles. The fracture was present. You could see the diagonal line if you were looking for it, but it was sealed. The surfaces had joined. I pressed the housing lip back into position and heard the articulation joint seat with the clean, decisive sound of mechanical parts finding their geometry. I picked up the chest plate and handed it to the queen. She took it. She held it at arm's length and looked at the repair. She pressed her thumb along the seam where I'd run mine. She rotated the plate and looked at the articulation joint from the back. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She put the plate on, unassisted. She shrugged into it, settled the housing at her shoulders, pressed the articulation point against her sternum. She took a breath, a full breath, the kind that tests whether a chest plate flexes correctly, whether the articulation joint allows the ribcage to expand. She turned at the waist. She brought her arms to the guard position. She looked at the seam. 2%, she said. 2%, I said. She looked at me for a long moment with those pale silver eyes. Then she said, "Dawn muster in 20 minutes. I'll see you on the parade ground." She walked out. The guard Sareth followed. I stood in the armory bay alone for a moment, listening to the wind. Then I cleaned my bench, racked my tools, and walked to the parade ground. The Velson First Compact Dawn Muster is a precise ceremony. The Queen's personal guard complement forms in 2 parallel lines facing the command position. The Queen reviews the lines. Each guard signals their equipment status in sequence. The Queen confirms the formation ready. 43 guards, equipment confirmed, formation held for 1 minute at parade rest. Then the command officer dismisses them to their rotation assignments. I'd watched it from a distance twice since arriving at the outpost. I hadn't been invited to stand close. I found a position at the edge of the parade ground near the armory bay door, which was where a civilian contractor had reasonable business being, and I stood there in the pre-dawn cold with my hands in my jacket pockets. The Queen came out of the command post at the precise moment she always did. Her guard complement formed up. The ceremony proceeded. She was wearing the repaired armor. There is a particular quality of attention that a military formation gives to its commanding officer's appearance. It's not overt. You don't look directly. You don't break formation. You don't comment. But it's total. Every guard in those 2 parallel lines was processing what they were seeing, and what they were seeing was the Queen's chest plate, repaired, carrying the faint diagonal line of a sealed fracture across the articulation joint. The review proceeded. The equipment signals ran down the formation. The Queen confirmed. And then from the second guard in the left line, a senior guard named Sorrel Velmon, I learned later, 17 years on the Queen's complement, a sound started. Low, rhythmic, 2 syllables repeated. The kind of sound that a formation produces when something has been decided and needs no further deliberation. It took me 3 repetitions to parse it. They were speaking Velson, not trade language. Sarath, standing at the edge of the parade ground near me, translated in a low voice without looking at me. "They're saying marry him," he said. The sound spread. 1 voice becomes 2, 2 become 4. By the time it reached the end of the right line, all 43 guards were chanting it. Low and rhythmic and completely at odds with the formal geometry of a dawn muster ceremony on a border outpost on a moon that nobody wanted to be assigned to. "Marry him, marry him, marry him." The Queen stood at the command position with her silver eyes on the formation. Her expression was the expression of someone managing the present moment from within a dignified composure that was doing moderate structural stress. 1 corner of her mouth was not entirely under her control. She let the chant run for 6 full repetitions. Then she raised 1 hand, and the formation went silent in the way that military formations go silent when they're suppressing something and don't entirely want to suppress it, the kind of silence that has laughter inside it. "Formation dismissed," she said. The guards broke. Several of them looked directly at me as they filed past. Not hostile, the opposite of hostile, the kind of look that communicates a position arrived at collectively and without nuance. "We have decided something about you, and we are informing you now." Soreth passed me last. He stopped briefly. "The senior guard set the bet at 4 months, he said. "What bet?" I said. "When she asks you," he said, and walked away. I stood at the edge of the parade ground until the last guard had cleared, feeling the wind come in from the border ridge and wondering what exactly had just happened. What had happened specifically was this. The Queen's personal guard complement, 43 soldiers of the Velson First Compact with a combined service record of several centuries, had watched their Queen walk onto a parade ground in repaired field armor on an outpost where the senior court armorer had declared the repair impossible. They had performed a dawn muster ceremony. And at the conclusion of that ceremony, they had expressed a collective opinion, in the ancient Velson chant form traditionally reserved for endorsement of union bonds, about what the human civilian contractor from sidearm maintenance should do next. None of this was in the compact field contract I'd signed. I went back to the armory bay to finish the sidearm maintenance I'd abandoned the night before. Vereth was there when I arrived. He was at his terminal, logging something, and he didn't look up when I came in. I went to the grinding bench and pulled out the rack of sidearms I'd left. The calibration equipment was where I'd set it down. I picked up the first unit and started where I'd left off. For about 10 minutes, The only sounds in the armory bay were the calibration unit's low processing hum and Verath's deliberate keystrokes. He was a careful typist. Every key was fully depressed and released before the next one. The kind of care that means the person typing considers what they're logging to be a record that will outlast the conversation. He finished. He didn't move from his terminal immediately. I kept working. "You ran a 3-stage cycle," he said. Not a question. He'd read the heat applicator logs. "Yes. Standard protocol is single stage. Standard protocol is optimized for depot compound," I said. "The copper silicate resin has a different viscosity at temperature. Single stage drives it to surface contact but not bond depth. 3 stages at reduced heat intervals drives it to grain penetration." A pause, longer than I expected. "The material specifications allow for a 3-stage cycle," he said. "It's in the footnotes of the secondary application table." "I know, that's where I found it." Another pause. "I don't read the footnotes," he said. He said it without particular inflection, neither defensive nor self-critical. Just a statement of how he worked, offered in the same register as everything else. "Most people don't," I said. He logged one more entry. Then he stood, gathered his tools, and left the armory without another word. But he left the terminal unlocked, which he never did. He was meticulous about terminal security, and the screen was showing the secondary application table, footnotes visible, the 3-stage protocol highlighted in the text. I looked at it for a moment. Then I finished calibrating the sidearm in my hands and moved to the next one. The Queen found me there an hour later. She came alone, which I noted. She stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in and closing the door behind her. "The depot request has been canceled," she said. "Good," I said. I was working on a calibration adjustment and kept working. "Verath has lodged a formal notation that he maintains his assessment under compact field maintenance protocol." "He's entitled to," I said. "He's correct about the certification." "He is." She moved to the position she'd occupied during the 3rd stage of the work, the stool at the side of the bench, and stood near it without sitting. "The guards have placed a collective unit endorsement in the formation log. It's non-binding." I gathered. They've also placed a secondary notation that the senior court armorer's assessment failed to account for available non-depot solutions. That's more pointed. They're an opinionated formation. I finished the calibration adjustment and set the sidearm down. I looked at the Queen. She was still wearing the repaired armor. The diagonal line of the sealed fracture was visible at the articulation joint, catching the worklight at a particular angle. "How long will it hold?" she said. "Under normal field conditions, indefinitely. The bond is at depot-grade depth. If the armor takes another direct high-velocity impact at the same location, the seam is the structural weak point. A second impact would propagate the fracture. So the armor should be replaced." "The armor should be replaced," I said. "But not because the repair won't hold. Because any armor that's taken one impact at that location is structurally compromised regardless of the repair quality. That's not a field maintenance problem. That's a replacement cycle problem." She looked at me for a moment. "You're telling me Verath was right about the replacement and wrong about the repair?" "Yes." "Most people," she said, "in your position would tell me he was simply wrong." "He's the senior court armorer for the Velson First Compact," I said. "He's right about most things. He was wrong about this specific thing because this specific thing was outside his experience and he defaulted to protocol. That's a reasonable thing to do. It's just not always the right thing." The Queen looked at the sealed crack in her chest plate. She looked at it the way I'd looked at it the night before from 3 angles, reading what it told her. "The guards," she said, "they've been in service on this rotation for 6 months. The border situation has been unresolved for the full 6 months. This outpost is not where any of them chose to be, and the situation here has been managed consistently within protocol. Nothing has been wrong. Nothing has been solved. Everything has been filed. She set her hand against the articulation joint, where the seam ran diagonal. Last night, she said, something was broken and someone fixed it. I waited. It's possible, she said, that the formation log endorsement reflects something other than an opinion about your personal qualifications as a marriage candidate. That's a generous interpretation, I said. It's an accurate one, she paused. The generous interpretation is also present. I looked at the sidearm on the bench. I looked at the queen. I thought about the pre-dawn cold and the wind off the border ridge and 43 Velsan guards filing past me with the look on their faces that said, "We have decided something about you." I have 11 more sidearms to calibrate today, I said. The queen looked at me. The corner of her mouth moved in the direction it had moved during the dawn muster. Then I won't keep you, she said. She left. The door closed. I sat in the armory bay for a moment listening to the ventilation and the wind. Then I picked up the next sidearm and got to work. The thing about doing a job well is that the job doesn't change based on who's watching. The sidearms required calibration. The calibration required the same attention whether the queen was standing next to me or not, whether there were 43 guards with opinions about my future or not, whether the senior court armorer was logging protests or not. You look at what's in front of you. You do what the thing requires. You move to the next thing. What I'd learned in 14 years of expeditionary maintenance and 7 months on this particular moon was that this approach, look at the thing, do what it requires, was rarer than it should be and more useful than most people gave it credit for. I finished the 11 sidearms by midday. Sareth brought food to the armory bay at the meal hour. He set it on the bench without being asked, the way you set something down when you've decided a person belongs in a place and acts accordingly. He said nothing and left, but he was back 20 minutes later with a second cup of the grain preparation, because he'd apparently concluded the first one wasn't enough. I didn't comment on either delivery. He seemed to take that as the correct response. The next 3 days were normal days on the outpost. The border situation stayed unresolved. The formation held its rotation. Vareth continued to manage the armor complement with the precision and thoroughness he always brought to it, and he did not speak to me, and I did not require him to. The queen stood review at dawn muster in the repaired armor, which held at the seam, because of course it did. I noticed, on the second day, that the other guards had started to bring things to the armory bay. Not dramatically. No one announced anything. Sorrel Velmon, the senior guard, left a rack of sidearms with a brief notation that said maintenance required, and the handwriting was the particularly careful handwriting of someone who knows their notation is going to be logged. 2 more guards brought equipment the following morning. By the 4th day, the armory bay had a small but steady stream of Velsan Royal Guard personnel, bringing me things that needed the same kind of attention I'd given the chest plate. None of them said anything about the chant. None of them needed to. On the 4th day, I was working on a power coupling in the maintenance bay when Sareth appeared in the doorway. "The queen asks if you have time," he said. "For what?" I said. "She didn't specify." I set down the coupling. "Yes," I said. He led me to the command post, to a small room off the primary planning chamber that had a table and 2 chairs, and a viewport looking onto the outpost's courtyard. The queen was at the table with 2 cups of something hot. She gestured to the second chair. I sat. "The depot replacement arrived this morning," she said, "ahead of the 42-hour estimate." "Efficient," I said. "It will go into service tomorrow. The repaired plate will be logged as non-field operational per protocol." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Vareth's formal notation will stand on the record." "As it should." "Your repair will also stand on the record," she said, "under my personal notation, as will the formation endorsement. She paused. The endorsement is non-binding, as I said. As you said. Kale Dawn. She looked at me directly with those pale silver eyes. Why did you learn the Velson material specifications? I thought about how to answer that. Because I was going to be working on a Velson outpost with Velson equipment, and I wanted to do my job properly. And if there had been no need for the knowledge, if the armor had never cracked, then I'd have known the material specifications for the next time something broke, I said. There's always a next time. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the viewport, I could see the courtyard. A few guards crossing on rotation assignments. The border ridge visible in the distance, gray and wind-scoured. The guard's endorsement, she said. To be clear about what it is a formation-level expression of collective regard. In Velson first compact tradition, such an expression carries cultural weight. It is not a proposal. It is not a formal petition. It is a statement of collective opinion. She looked at her cup. The guards have never done this before, in the 11 years I have commanded this compliment. For any human, I said, or in general? In general, she said. The wind was audible through the composite walls. The viewport showed the ridge, gray and constant. I don't know what to do with that, I said. Honest was what the moment required. Neither do I, she said, yet. She looked at me. I looked at her. The light through the viewport was the particular flat gray of a border moon midday, and in that light the amber gold of her scale markings at the jaw caught it differently than it had under the armory work lights, warmer, more complex. The pale silver of her eyes was the color of the seam in the repaired chest plate, the mark of something that had been broken and been made whole, carrying the evidence of both things at once. You'll continue your contract through the standard term, she said. It was not a question. Yes. The formation has placed a secondary notation, requesting the contract be extended. Also non-binding. Also non-binding, she said, and the corner of her mouth moved again in the direction it had been moving. The senior guard has also noted, in the formation log, that the armory maintenance quality has improved significantly since your arrival, which he attributes to, and I am quoting directly, the human's habit of doing what the thing requires rather than what the procedure says the thing requires. I thought about that. That's a generous assessment from a Velson senior guard. They are, as I said, an opinionated formation. They seem to have decided something, I said. They have, she said. So have I. She met my eyes with a directness that had nothing of the court in it. I'm telling you now rather than letting it accumulate in formation log entries. The wind shifted outside. The gray midday light held steady. All right, I said. She nodded once precisely. The same nod she'd given me at the end of stage 2, in the armory at the 3rd hour past midnight, when I told her the first 2 stages were good. It was, I realized, the nod she used when something was what it said it was, when something had been assessed accurately and found to be exactly that, no more, no less. I picked up the cup she'd set in front of me. The contents were warm, Velson preparation, something grain-based and darker than coffee. I'd had it before in the formation mess and liked it more than I'd expected to. We sat in the small room off the planning chamber for a while, with the border ridge visible through the viewport and the wind doing its constant work outside, and drank the warm thing, and said nothing more about the formation log or the endorsement or what had been decided. There was no need to. The depot armor was installed the following day. The repaired plate went into the non-operational log with Verath's notation, and the Queen's personal notation both attached, the protocol assessment and the field commander's assessment, both on the record, both accurate, neither canceling the other. Sareth told me later that Verath had reviewed the personal notation and filed a secondary acknowledgement that the repair had held under field conditions. He didn't say anything to me directly. I didn't require him to. 2 weeks after that, the border situation resolved. Not dramatically, a mapping clarification, a resource use protocol, 3 parties agreeing in writing to what the 4th party signed the following day. The kind of resolution that doesn't feel like a resolution until someone points out that the tension you'd been carrying is gone. The outpost's rotation assignments shifted. Half the guard complement rotated out. Sareth stayed. Sorrel Velmon stayed. I found out later that both of them had filed for voluntary continuation at Kethoran rather than accept rotation out, which was unusual enough that the regional command had queried it. The query response, filed by Sorrel Velmon and countersigned by Sareth and 4 other guards who also chose to stay, cited operational continuity requirements and equipment maintenance program integrity. Sareth told me this with a complete absence of self-consciousness, the way he told me most things. The formation logging system had been updated to include a new category. The category was labeled, in Velson, something that Sareth translated for me as considered endorsements, standing. The standing part meant the endorsement remained active until formally withdrawn. The considered part meant it had been arrived at through deliberation rather than impulse. I asked Sareth how long the guards had deliberated. About 3 minutes, he said. The senior guard said it first. Everyone else agreed. 3 minutes isn't very deliberate. Sorrel Velmon is a very efficient deliberator, Sareth said, and left the armory with the expression of a person who has delivered a perfectly calibrated observation and does not require a response. My contract extension had been submitted through the standard compact civilian contractor channel and approved without comment by the regional administration, which was normal. It had also been countersigned by the Queen's personal notation system, which was not standard, and which the compact's regional administrator had apparently reviewed and decided not to question. There were 3 additional items in my contractor file that hadn't been there before: the Queen's personal notation on the repair, the formation endorsement, and a line in the outpost equipment log that said armory maintenance quality, significantly improved, 7 months, contractor Dawn C. The last one was logged by Vereth Salntal. I read it twice to make sure I had it right. The diagonal seam in the non-operational chest plate is still in the outpost storage. I know because I checked once, about 4 months later. It's in a labeled case with both notations attached. The one that says the repair was beyond field maintenance protocol parameters, and the one that says the repair held. Both things are true. They don't contradict each other. They describe the same piece of metal from 2 different positions. The thing I've thought about since then is that they both had to exist on the record. Vereth's notation had to be there because he was right about the certification and the protocol, and a record that erases the accurate parts of an assessment it disagrees with isn't an honest record. The Queen's notation had to be there because the repair worked, and that was also true. And a record that only notes the protocol and ignores the outcome isn't honest either. 2 people looked at the same object from different positions and described what they saw. The descriptions sit next to each other in the file. Anyone who reads the file gets the full picture. I think there's something in that worth knowing, not just for armorers. I think about the crack itself, too, sometimes. How the fracture followed a pre-stressed seam in the casting, not a flaw, just the nature of how the metal cooled and set. The seam was always there. It had always been a potential line of failure, invisible and quiet, until something hit it at the exact right velocity and angle to find it. That's not a deficiency in the metal. That's just what metal is. You can't build something without the possibility of a break point somewhere. The question is what you do when the break happens. The thing I've come to is this: a break point found and sealed is stronger than one that was never tested. Not always, not every repair closes to the same integrity. But when it's done right, when the chemistry is correct and the heat is controlled and the time is given, the bond goes deeper than the original surface. The integration fills the grain structure in a way that wasn't there before the fracture. The seam is visible. It will always be visible if you know where to look. But the material at the seam is, in a specific structural sense, more fully bonded than the material around it. I told this to the Queen once late in the extended rotation, in the small room off the planning chamber over the grain preparation that had become a standing thing between us on evenings when the day's work was done. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened. Then she said, "My father would have said the same thing." In a longer speech. How much longer? He was a thorough man. I thought about my father, who had also been a thorough man, in a barn on a world no one cared about, with broken equipment and the knowledge to fix it. The thorough ones usually are right, I said. They are, she said. It's one of the few things that's reliable. I think about that too. The small things that are reliable, the grain preparation at the end of the day, the wind off the border ridge that never stops, the sidearms that come in needing calibration and go back out calibrated, the seam in the metal that holds because the chemistry was right and the time was given. I think about 43 voices, low and rhythmic in the cold pre-dawn, saying something in Velson that I needed a translation to understand and didn't need a translation to feel. I think about that sometimes when I'm at the bench, how the same object can be accurately described in two ways that look like disagreement but aren't, how the crack and the seal are both part of what the metal is now, how you can read one or the other, depending on where you're standing and what you're looking for. The senior guards formation log entry stays in my head too. The habit of doing what the thing requires rather than what the procedure says the thing requires. I've been a lot of things over the years: a maintenance sergeant, a civilian contractor, a man who read a materials database on a long transit and filed the specifications in case they were needed. What Sorrel Velman put in the formation log, in the careful Velson of someone who wanted the notation to last, is the most accurate description of what I am that anyone has ever committed to a record. That matters to me, not because of where it appeared or in whose formation log, or what the guards were chanting at dawn muster when they decided to tell me so. It matters because it's true, and because the person who decided to countersign the contract extension, who read the same formation log entry, and looked at the same diagonal seam in the same sealed chest plate, and arrived at her own assessment, which she told me directly in a small room off the planning chamber with the border ridge gray through the viewport and 2 cups of warm grain preparation between us. She put something in her personal notation system around the same time. I haven't read it. Sareth offered to tell me what it said. I told him it wasn't necessary. I already know what accurate looks like when I see it.